In March 1996, on a windy Tuesday morning between Concordia and Hutchinson, Hank Porter pulled a 1979 Chevrolet C20 into the gravel apron of Malloy Ag Systems, and three salesmen stopped mid-conversation because they assumed the truck belonged to a hired hand looking for temporary works. The Chevrolet had 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust eaten through both rear fenders, one side mirror taped at the base, and baling twine looped twice through the tailgate latch to keep it shut over washboard roads. Hank stepped out in patched brown coveralls, a sun-faded cap with no logo, and boots cracked white at the creases. He looked, to anyone scanning the lot for buying power, like a man one bad season from quitting. Trent Malloy noticed him from the office window and adjusted his pressed blue shirt cuffs before walking out with a salesman's smile that had closed plenty of six-figure notes. Trent wore clean leather boots that had never carried mud into a field, and he leaned against a new dually with chrome still bright from yesterday's wash. The social script in that lot was familiar. Visible polish meant creditworthiness. Visible wear meant risk. Hank asked about support for older equipment and said he was considering whether his father's 1978 Big Bud 360 was worth bringing back into service. Trent laughed. Not cruelly at first, more as a reflex of disbelief, and asked why anyone would sink time into scrap when financing had never been easier at 8.4% for qualified operators. The crux of Hank's life was already in place by then. He appeared poor enough to be dismissed in 10 seconds, yet he was quietly running 640 rented acres in Cloud County with no operating loan, no revolving credit account, and no machinery payment schedule sitting over his winter planning. While neighbors compared payment terms at Co-op Coffee, Hank kept a paper ledger in a biscuit tin above his pantry and measured risk one line at a time. In his machine shed, under a faded canvas, sat his father's dead Big Bud with a seized turbo and blown head gasket. Tied to the steering wheel by twine was a handwritten tag in block letters. Debt will farm you before you farm land. Hank had not arrived at that philosophy through slogans. He had arrived through arithmetic and memory. His father, Glenn Porter, had farmed through the late 1970s expansion wave, then watched interest rates crush men who had never missed sunrise in their lives. Glenn did borrow once, and that single note nearly split the family operation. In 1981, he financed a combine for $74,000 at 13.2%, because everyone said scale was survival. The annual payment came to $13,796 over 7 years, which looked manageable on paper when wheat was strong. By year 3, price swings and repair overlap turned each payment month into a triage exercise, and by year 5, Glenn sold feeder cattle he had intended to hold just to keep the note current. He paid the combine off, but he paid for it twice in stress and once in dollars. The machine itself lasted. The lesson lasted longer. At Hank's father's funeral in April 1996, after the line at the church thinned and casserole trays were stacked in foil on the counter, the estate lawyer handed Hank a small packet and a ring of keys. The estate was simple enough to read aloud in under 10 minutes. Hank received 3 assets exactly: the non-running 1978 Big Bud 360, 160 acres appraised at $128,000 with 0 liens, and a sealed envelope from Glenn marked "Open After Service." Inside was one sentence and a folded ledger sheet. The sentence read, "Debt will farm you before you farm land, unless you quit first." The ledger was Glenn's hand, neat columns in pencil, detailing a neighbor's machinery package that started at $190,000 at 10.9% and ended in $312,744, paid over 12 years after resets, fees, and carry costs. Glenn had circled the final total twice. Under it, he wrote, "That extra $122,744 could have bought land." 2 weeks later, Trent visited Hank's yard in that same pressed shirt, stepping around a leak pan beneath the big bud, as though walking through a museum of bad decisions. He brought brochures and a package pitch designed to feel inevitable. New articulated tractor, planter, and combine. Total $286,000, 15% down, variable rate financing, dealership support, and real farmer capacity. Hank asked one question: what were the cash repair parts for the big bud rebuild? Trent glanced at his clipboard and gave him the number, $4,870, then shook his head and chuckled as if the choice had already disqualified itself. Hank thanked him, closed the brochure, and said he would pass. What looked stubborn from the road was in fact a disciplined decomposition of risk. Hank spent May and June at 3 salvage auctions. At the first, he bought a used turbo core and housing for $1,180. At the second, he secured a cylinder head from a parted-out unit for $1,950. At the third, he picked up gasket kits, hoses, and fittings for $810. Total, $3,940. He paid cash at each sale, loaded parts into the same rusted Chevrolet, and drove home before dusk to clean and catalog every component on a plywood bench. Machine costs were not only purchase price to him, they were interest exposure, forced timing, and sleep. By harvest of 1997, the rebuilt Big Bud was pulling again. It was not pretty. Paint was dull, panels mismatched, and the cab smelled faintly of diesel and old vinyl. It worked. Hank's books for that year were plain enough to fit on 4 pages. Net farm income, $41,300. Living costs, $16,800. Savings, $24,500. He kept living costs lean by design. House repairs, $1,400. Groceries, $4,980. Fuel for personal use, $1,920. Utilities, $2,760. Health insurance, $3,540. Clothing, $520. Property taxes and insurance on the inherited 160 acres folded into farm overhead. He did not deprive himself as performance. He simply refused to spend what could become optionality later. In 1999, when a retiring owner offered 80 acres in Reno County at $615 per acre, Hank wrote a check for $49,200 and closed without a lender meeting. In 2002, he bought a used 1974 grain drill for $350 at a consignment sale, while a neighboring operation financed a new unit near $28,000. The neighbor was not foolish. He was operating inside prevailing consensus, where modernity signaled viability. Hank's framework differed. He compared field performance and repair profiles, then compared the cash outlay against years of avoided payments. In 2004, he added grain bins for $22,700 cash. That one decision reduced basis losses by 19 cents per bushel across 62,000 bushels, preserving $11,780 in a single cycle and paying back roughly half the project in year 1 under ordinary spreads. Arithmetic kept confirming what image concealed. Trent kept pressing him in public spaces where status could do its work. At co-op meetings, he would ask, in a tone pitched to the room, whether Hank planned to join this century or keep patching antiques. Hank never delivered speeches back. He answered in short lines. Paid for works. Rates do not sleep. Land first, paint later. Men laughed, then changed topics. A few noticed he was still standing after difficult years while payment-heavy operations tightened each season. Hank let the laughter pass and kept writing numbers in the same tight hand because he trusted ledgers more than showroom talk and knew the next turning point would come from arithmetic, not applause. By the second week of October 2006, Hank's biscuit tin held 10 years of ledgers, each page carrying the same quiet thesis in different columns. Avoid compounding obligations, accumulate productive assets, keep fixed costs survivable when prices break against you. The big bud that had arrived as scrap now handled heavy tillage and winter snow pushes. The inherited 160 acres had become a base, not an endpoint. The 80 purchased acres were clear title. The bins were full. Cash reserves were not dramatic, but they were real. He still wore patched coveralls. He still drove the same 1979 Chevrolet with twine on the tailgate. From the road, he looked unchanged. Underneath, the structure was becoming unshakable. That same afternoon, Hank drove the 1979 Chevrolet from his yard to the Cloud County Fairgrounds for a consignment preview, because a retired operator from Milton Vale had listed 2 tillage tools and a fuel trailer that might fit Hank's winter plan. Dust tracked behind the truck in a thin line, and the twine on the tailgate fluttered like a loose flag as he turned through the gate. Men in clean jackets stood beside new pickups with dealership decals, comparing trade-in allowances and spring delivery dates. Trent Malloy was there too, catalog in hand, polished boots untouched by mud, moving through the crowd with the practiced pace of a man who expected agreement before he finished speaking. Hank climbed out wearing the same patched brown coveralls, cap faded to a color somewhere between tan and gray, and gloves mended at the thumb seam with dark thread. A younger salesman near Trent glanced once at the truck, then asked whether Hank was there to help load equipment after the sale. Trent recognized him and smiled in that narrow way that made judgment sound like advice. He said there was a pre-approval desk inside, then added that serious buyers were locking in variable notes before rates moved again. Hank asked only one question, pointing to a weathered 28-foot field cultivator tagged Lot 117. What was the reserve? 7,500, Trent said loud enough for 3 nearby farmers to hear. Cash buyers do not usually play in this row. Hank nodded, folded the sale bill into his pocket, and walked the line in silence, checking welds, hydraulic hoses, and wheel bearings with his hand instead of his eyes. 35 minutes later, he bought Lot 117 for $6,900, the fuel trailer for $1,250, and a pallet of shanks and sweeps for $420. Total, $8,570. He paid the clerk with a cashier check from First Plains Bank and $200 in bills. Trent watched the receipt print, then looked back at the rusted truck as if the arithmetic had violated a social rule. The misjudgment never surprised Hank anymore. It had become predictable, almost procedural. If a man arrived in a spotless half-ton financed over 72 months, people assumed strength. If a man arrived in a $40 cap and boots repaired twice, people assumed strain. The underlying framework ran the other direction. 3 days later, while sorting invoices at the kitchen table, Hank opened Glenn Porter's old ledger bundle again. Not because nostalgia pulled him there, but because winter planning always started with first principles. The table itself carried shallow knife marks from 3 generations, and a dark ring where a coffee mug had sat for years. Glenn used to say the table told the truth faster than a showroom. Numbers either held or they did not. The deepest mark in Hank's memory was not a speech, and it was not a dramatic loss in his own name. It was a sale bill from August 1985 when he was 19 and standing with Glenn at a neighbor's auction 2 miles east of Rice. The neighbor, Howard Blakely, had borrowed against rising land values, then rolled machinery notes into an operating line when 2 weak wheat years came back to back. Howard was not reckless. He was methodical. Church every Sunday, machinery maintained, books balanced as best he could, but his debt stack had no room for weather. Hank watched the auctioneer close on Howard's last tractor at $31,000, well below what Howard still owed across refinanced notes. Glenn did not say much on the drive home. At the stop sign by the old grain elevator, he finally said, "He did not fail at farming. He failed at surviving interest." That sentence hardened into method over the next decade. In 1988, Glenn showed Hank how to price borrowed money in plain terms: principal, rate, years, total paid, and what that total could have purchased if kept in cash flow. They did the exercise on notebook paper with a feed store pen. A $120,000 machinery note at 9.5% over 10 years did not feel like $100,000 to $20,000. It felt like $186,420 by final payment with fees. The extra $66,420 was not abstract. At then-current local values near $540 per acre, it represented 123 acres not purchased. Land generated rent, crop, collateral, and options. Interest generated none of those. That decomposition became Hank's operating paradigm before he ever ran his own acres. By 1991, Hank rented his first 160 acres independently at $41 per acre cash rent, total $6,560 due in 2 installments. Wheat yielded 37 bushels per acre that year at $3.12 per bushel, grossing $18,470 before expenses. Inputs and fuel ran $8,940. Rent and insurance added $7,180. Net was thin, $2,350, but positive. He did not celebrate. He logged it and planned the next year. 1992. Rented 240 acres. Average cash rent, $43. Gross crop revenue, $41,220. Total expenses, $34,660. Retained $6,560. 1993. Hail damage on 1/4 cut yields hard. Gross $38,940. Expenses $35,880. Retained $3,060. 1994. Added custom baling work. Gross from crops plus custom $52,780. Expenses $41,110. Retained $11,670. 1995. Repaired used planter for $690 in parts. Avoided replacing at roughly $19,000 financed. Gross $57,300. Expenses $43,240. Retained $14,060. 1996. Glenn died, and Hank absorbed the inherited 160 acres with 0 lien, which removed rental exposure on that block and changed his fixed cost profile permanently. Before we go any further, If you want to see exactly how this plain ledger logic turns into a balance sheet that shocks an entire auction yard, subscribe now and stay with the arithmetic, because the turning point only makes sense when each small line is counted. Hank learned discipline from repetition, not from one grand decision. Every December he built the next year around worst-case pricing rather than optimistic pricing. If wheat penciled at $4.20, he budgeted $3.60. If diesel sat at $2.10, he tested $2.60. If repairs averaged $18 per acre, he modeled $27. He called it farming the downside first. It made his bids conservative and sometimes cost him leases. It also kept him in the game when assumptions failed. By the first week of January 2007, he had already mapped a 3-envelope cash system in the biscuit tin: Operations Reserve, Repair Reserve, and Opportunity Reserve. Operations carried 6 months of ordinary bills. Repair carried enough to replace 1 major engine and 1 hydraulic failure without borrowing. Opportunity stayed untouched unless a tax sale, estate parcel, or distressed machinery lot priced below intrinsic field value. Most years, that 3rd envelope did nothing for months. That was the point. Optionality required waiting. He applied the same patience to machinery that others applied to financing packages. The big bud got oil samples every 100 hours and coolant checks every Saturday during heavy use. He kept a handwritten maintenance board in the shed, dates in one column, part numbers in another, labor time in the third. In 2007, he spent $2,340 on preventive work and avoided a late-season turbo failure estimated near $8,900 if it had cascaded into injector damage. In 2008, he bought a second used grain cart for $4,600 and rebuilt the auger, flighting for $780, total $5,380. A comparable new cart quoted through Trent's lot was $32,400 before tax and finance costs. Simple living remained the quiet engine beneath every larger number. Hank's annual household budget in 2008 was $18,940. Groceries, $5,240. Utilities, $3,180. Health insurance, $4,220. Fuel and personal vehicle upkeep, $2,460. Clothing and boots, $640. Home maintenance, $1,900. Church and local giving, $1,300. Housing payment has $0. He lived in the same house, fixed what broke, and upgraded only when utility or safety demanded it. People sometimes called it sacrifice. Hank called it margin. In 2009, when an estate west of Clyde listed 120 acres of mixed-quality ground, bidding opened at $1,980 per acre and stalled at $2,140 because drainage work was needed on the north end. Hank had walked the parcel twice, flagged tile issues, and priced repairs at $24,000. He bid $2,200 per acre, totaled $264,000, plus closing and immediate tile work for an all-in cost of $292,600. He paid cash from accumulated reserves and a treasury ladder he had started years earlier. The first full season after drainage corrections, that ground averaged 54 bushels, wheat equivalent per acre, versus county average 47 on comparable soils. Conservative net contribution after direct costs was $21,600 for the year. The parcel was not glamorous. It was accretive. The social contrast sharpened as the county entered a credit-heavy phase. Good farmers took sensible-seeming packages, because the prevailing consensus said efficiency demanded constant replacement cycles. Monthly notes rose quietly in the background, while commodity prices looked cooperative. At coffee counters, people compared horsepower and cab features. Hank compared resilience ratios. Fixed obligations divided by conservative gross. His stayed below 0.22. Several peers drifted above 0.45. That spread looked academic in good years and existential in bad ones. By late summer 2010, Trent tried once more in public, this time at a co-op board dinner in Concordia. He said Hank was under-mechanized, under-leveraged, and one weather event from being obsolete. Hank set down his coffee and answered in 11 words. I can survive 3 bad years. Can your payment plan do that? The table fell quiet, not from drama, but because everyone there could run the same math if they chose to. He drove home that night in the same rusted Chevrolet, heater fan rattling, odometer creeping toward 330,000. The truck looked tired under the gas station lights. His balance sheet did not. He parked beside the shed, checked the twine knot on the tailgate out of habit, and wrote one final line in the ledger before bed. Cash is not fear. Cash is timing. The next morning, he reopened the ledger and drew a line under that sentence, then wrote the first projection for 2011 in pencil. Expected gross revenue at conservative prices, expected direct costs at elevated inputs, and a red box threshold showing the point where most financed operations would begin borrowing just to stay current. He calculated wheat at $5.10, even though local chatter was closer to $5.85, set diesel at $3.45, though winter contracts were lower, and carried repair assumptions 20% above his 5-year average. His target was not record profit. His target was durability. By the end of March 2011, he had locked in seed and fertilizer with cash discounts worth $11,940 across all acres, partly because suppliers preferred immediate payment, and partly because he bought plain formulations without custom blends that looked modern in marketing sheets but did not pencil out on his soils. Planning ran late after 2 wet weeks, and he logged extra field passes that added $4.70 per acre in fuel and labor equivalent. Yet his operation still closed the crop year with net farm income of $128,600 after all direct costs. He moved $70,000 into short-term treasuries at staggered maturities, left $40,000 in operating reserve, and used $18,600 to prepay property tax and insurance on owned parcels. No lender approval was required for any move. In the first week of January 2017, Hank wrote one of his cleanest year-by-year sequences, each line short and plain, each line carrying the weight of future optionality. 2011, gross $612,400, total farm costs $483,800, net $128,600, no term debt. 2012 projection, before weather stress, gross $590,000, cost $476,000. 2012 actual after drought impact, gross $544,700, cost $459,200, net $85,500. 2013, gross $571,300, cost $471,600, net $99,700. 2014, gross $603,900, cost $487,100, net $116,800. 2015, gross $618,200. Costs $494,900. Net $123,300. 2016. Gross $640,500. Costs $503,200. Net $137,300. 6 years. Cumulative net $691,200, and every dollar allocated before it could leak into status spending. That progression did not come from one lucky crop cycle. It came from repeated price comparison and refusal of interest drag. In 2012, he bought a used 1986 chisel plow for $7,400 and spent $1,260 on shanks and wear parts. Total $8,660. A comparable new setup quoted through dealer channels was $46,800 before tax. Difference in immediate outlay, $38,140. If financed over 7 years at 6.8%, the total paid on the new unit would have reached roughly $58,870, widening the true spread to $50,210. He did not save that spread as an abstract number. He redirected it into timing power. 3 days after finishing wheat harvest in 2013, he used that timing power at a county tax sale where a 40-acre parcel with drainage issues and poor road frontage drew thin bidding. He paid $74,000 cash, plus $6,900 in filing and cleanup costs. Total basis $80,900, or $2,022.50 per acre. He installed tile repair sections and ditch clearing for $9,300 over the next 4 months, bringing all-in costs to $90,200. By 2015, the parcel was producing at levels that justified a conservative value near $3,050 per acre, implying paper equity of roughly $31,800 above his total basis while contributing real crop volume every season. By late September 2014, the grain bin decision from a decade earlier showed its full compounding value. With 62,000 bushels moving through storage and average basis improvement, still near 19 cents in normal spread conditions, annual retained value was around $11,780 before accounting for occasional, wider carry opportunities. Over 10 seasons, even with variability and maintenance deductions, the bins had generated more than $96,000 in cumulative advantage against initial cost and upkeep. That single project had outperformed countless cosmetic upgrades celebrated in co-op parking lots. Hank wrote the calculation in the margin beside Glenn's old sentence and circled it once. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure rises and everyone around you insists, leverage is the price of staying relevant. Do you choose appearances? Or do you choose arithmetic that still works after 2 bad years in a row? That choice decides far more than machinery color. It decides who gets to keep making choices later. In Cloud and Reno counties, the contrast was never about intelligence. It was about framework. Eli Jensen, who farmed 520 acres and had a reputation for careful agronomy, signed equipment notes totaling $410,000 at 7.9% between 2008 and 2011, rolling a tractor, planter, and combine into blended payments he expected to cover from strong corn years. His annual machinery obligation landed near $61,200 before major repairs. He was not reckless with money. He was optimistic about continuity. When yield and price moved together against him, continuity disappeared faster than anyone expected. Marta Ruiz made a different but equally understandable decision. She took an $860,000 land note to secure adjoining ground that improved her field layout and labor efficiency. Fixed initially at 5.2%, with reset language she believed would remain manageable. For the first years it did. Her payment profile was tight but serviceable, and she worked relentlessly to meet it. Then the reset moved her rate to 8.1%, raising annual debt service by tens of thousands while fertilizer and fuel climbed. She kept paying longer than most people could have. In 2013, she was still short, and the auction notice went up on a fence line she had repaired with her own hands. Cal Bishop carried pressure through operating credit instead of term notes, which felt safer until it did not. During a drought cycle, his line expanded to $290,000, partly from feed and fuel, partly from holding costs while waiting for better sale timing that never arrived. Interest on revolving balances compounded monthly. At rates above 7%, his carrying cost alone became a second utility bill the size of a payroll line. He sold what he could, cut where he could, and still filed bankruptcy protection in 2014 because the structure left no breathing room. People who judged him from a distance ignored how many seasons he had worked from before sunrise to after dark, trying to avoid exactly that outcome. Dwayne Holloway, practical and widely liked, accepted balloon structures on land and machinery because the initial payments looked light enough to preserve flexibility. The flexibility was real only if refinance windows stayed open. When he missed 2 consecutive balloon deadlines, he sold under pressure at $2,950 per acre, while nearby fair value sat closer to $3,600. On 300 acres, that discount alone represented roughly $195,000 in value, transferred by timing rather than by farming skill. He did not lose because he lacked discipline. He lost because his obligations matured on the lender's schedule instead of the weather's schedule. Hank never turned any of those outcomes into a sermon. In 2012 and 2013, he sent labor where he could without publicity, hauling grain for Eli during a week of equipment downtime, helping Marta finish one section before a storm line, welding a broken hitch for Cal at no charge, and running snow clearance for Dwayne's lane after an ice event when Dwayne was driving custom loads 2 counties away to stay solvent. He understood the underlying tension better than most critics did. Good operators can still be cornered when rates, yields, and maturities align against them. By July 2012, the crisis phase was no longer theoretical. Rainfall in key weeks fell short, pastures browned early, and diesel moved above $4 per gallon. Fertilizer invoices came in about 38% higher than comparable applications from 2 years prior. Variable rate debt that had looked harmless at signing began repricing monthly, and conversations in line at the supplier shifted from expansion to extensions. Hank's fixed annual obligations remained property tax, insurance, and household costs totaling $29,460. That number mattered because it defined his survival threshold. He could meet it from weak seasons without borrowing. Many peers could not meet theirs even in average seasons once resets took hold. On an August evening in 2013, at the same scarred kitchen table, where Glenn had taught him to price interest in acres, Hank ran the most important pivot calculation of his life. Option 1. Expand with borrowed money while land values look strong. Option 2. Hold debt-free posture and wait for distressed parcels priced below productive value. He chose option 2 again, then executed it with precision when opportunities appeared. The 120 acres he had already bought in 2009 at $2,200 per acre for $264,000 remained the anchor of that strategy. At tax and estate events over the next cycle, he acquired 200 acres at $2,480 per acre for $496,000. Combined purchase basis across those tracts was $760,000. Closing, legal, and immediate corrective work added $38,600. All-in basis, $798,600, paid in cash from reserves, maturities, and retained earnings. The strategic significance was larger than acreage. At a conservative local valuation, near $3,900 per acre by 2016, those 320 acres carried gross market value around $1,248,000, implying unrealized equity of approximately $449,400 above all-in basis while generating annual production. More important, no lender could force a sale during a weak cycle because there was no note to call. Debt avoidance had shifted from defensive posture to offensive capability. It was no longer merely about sleeping through volatility. It was about buying optionality when volatility punished leveraged balance sheets. In November 2014, 3 days after Cal filed, Hank drove the 1979 Chevrolet to town for parts, twine still holding the tailgate and rust still visible under the license plate bracket. He looked exactly like the man Trent had laughed at in 1996. He bought filters, hydraulic oil, and a set of bearings, then stopped at First Plains to renew a treasury ladder at prevailing yields and moved another $55,000 into staggered maturities. The teller knew his account history and said nothing performative. Quiet numbers moved across a quiet counter. By the first week of February 2015, Trent had softened his pitch in public meetings. Less swagger, more caution around variable terms, because too many repossessions were now visible from county roads. Yet he still framed leverage as unavoidable for anyone serious about scale. Hank responded as he always had, in short lines and complete calm. Scale without control is rented risk. He did not raise his voice. He did not look around for approval. He wrote his input checks, returned to the shed, and serviced the big bud for spring. Spring 2016 opened with better moisture and steadier markets, and the county breathed a little easier. Hank treated the relief as temporary, not permanent. He updated the ledger, marked reserve targets higher, and kept living exactly as before. Modest house, repaired clothes, old truck, paid bills, no interest clock running in the background. From the road, he remained the same weathered figure, climbing into a machine most people had written off 20 years earlier. In the books, however, the pattern was now undeniable. While leveraged operations spent recovery years rebuilding equity they had lost to rate stress, Hank spent those same years compounding purchasing power for the next dislocation. By late harvest in 2016, that next dislocation arrived in a shape few people expected, not as one dramatic collapse, but as a sequence of estate liquidations, deferred maintenance sales, and families choosing certainty over another cycle of rate exposure. Hank watched listings the way other operators watched weather radar, patient, unemotional, ready. He attended previews, walked fence lines, checked tile maps, and wrote ceiling bids in the margin of his ledger before every event. If the number crossed his threshold, he left. If it stayed below intrinsic value, he bought and went home. In March 2017, he acquired 160 acres from an estate north of Hutchinson at $3,420 per acre, total $547,200, then spent $41,800 on terrace repair and 2 culvert replacements before fall rains. all-in basis $589,000. In June, he purchased a 1998 combine with 3,900 separator hours for $46,000 cash, added $9,700 in preseason work, and ran it for less than one-third of what a new finance package would have cost over 5 years. By November, he had moved another $120,000 from crop proceeds into short-duration treasuries maturing in ladders of 3, 6, and 12 months. He was not hoarding cash. He was staging it. The decisive day came on September 14th, 2018, at an estate auction outside Hutchinson, where 480 contiguous acres were offered as a single block with a posted target of $1,920,000. The crowd was larger than usual, partly because the tract had clean access and reliable well rights, partly because people expected syndicated financing to drive the final number. Trent Malloy stood near the clerk table in a crisp dealership jacket, still carrying the old confidence, still reading rooms by clothing instead of balance sheets. Hank arrived in the same 1979 Chevrolet, now past 348,000 miles, rust darker around both wheel wells, tailgate still held by fresh baling twine. When bidding slowed and then stalled near the reserve, Trent turned toward a cluster of operators and said, loud enough to travel, that closing this block required real liquidity, not wishful talk. He glanced at Hank when he said it. Hank did not answer. He stepped to the clerk table, set down a worn brown folder, and opened it to 3 cashier checks: $1 million, $700,000, and $244,000, issued by First Plains Bank and Prairie State Trust, payable to the estate account. Total available at table, $1,944,000. Purchase price, fees, and immediate tile contingency were covered in full, without financing conditions. Silence moved across the tent in a way no speech could have managed. The clerk checked each instrument twice. Trent asked for a verification call. Not combative now, procedural. The bank manager confirmed funds while Hank stood with his cap in his hand and eyes on the paperwork. 10 minutes later, the sale was final. No lender packet. No variable rate rider. No collateral chain beyond the land itself. Before leaving, Hank also bought 3 older machines from secondary lots Trent had once mocked as dead iron, paying $118,600 cash for the set because their field value exceeded their appearance by a wide margin. That afternoon became the public revelation, but the private arithmetic behind it was cleaner than the spectacle suggested. Hank's liquid position on auction day was $2,146,300 across cash and treasuries before settlement. After the 480-acre purchase and machinery buys, he still held $83,700 in immediate reserve and unencumbered grain inventory, valued at $412,000 at conservative pricing. The room had expected a man stretching for status. What they saw was a man deploying prepared liquidity on a pre-written plan. 3 days passed before Trent drove out to Hank's place with closing copies and a different posture. He walked past the big Bud parked by the shed, paint still uneven, tires dusted from field work, and asked if Hank had ever considered what those same years could have looked like with more leverage in expansion phases. Hank took the folder, scanned the deed pages, and answered in 12 words. I considered it every winter. Then I priced the downside first. Trent nodded once, no argument, and left without another pitch. If you are learning something from this, pass it to one person who confuses borrowing capacity with financial strength, because those are not the same asset in a volatile county economy. Hank's next move made that distinction concrete. In January 2019, he filed formation papers for the Porter Grounded Futures Foundation and endowed it with $3 million from post-harvest cash and maturing treasuries. The charter was narrow by design: zero interest equipment notes for local operators under 40, debt recovery grants tied to formal farm business training, and transitional land access for families with proven work records, but weak collateral. He refused naming rights on buildings and declined a public dinner. The foundation office was a desk in the old co-op annex with one part-time bookkeeper and strict underwriting rules copied from his own ledger habits. The first 12 equipment notes were issued between 2019 and 2023, average principal $42,000, total principal $504,000, zero interest, 5-year term, and one line at the bottom of every contract. Pay me when you can, but send your books every quarter. 2 recipients paid early and recycled funds into the same pool. 3 needed extensions after weather setbacks and received them without penalties because they filed complete numbers on time. By the end of 2024, outstanding principal had declined to $287,400, while all 12 operations remained active. That survival rate mattered more than repayment speed. He also funded 4 debt recovery grants of $25,000 each for the children of Eli Jensen, Marta Ruiz, Cal Bishop, and Dwayne Holloway. But the grants were never handed over as blank checks. Each recipient had to complete a 120-hour program in enterprise budgeting, working capital management, and contract risk with Kansas Extension instructors. Eli's daughter, Nora Jensen, used her grant to secure grain merchandising certification and now manages hedge policy at the cooperative elevator where her father works operations. Marta's son, Luis Ruiz, applied his grant to lease equipment and start a custom planting service that now covers 3,200 acres each spring. Cal's daughter, Beth Bishop, paired the grant with savings from the repair shop and built a mobile hydraulics unit that serves 3 counties. Dwayne's twin sons, Owen and Cole Holloway, pooled their grant with wages from harvest crews and purchased a used grain trailer fleet, 5 units total, all paid for within 3 seasons. The most visible gift came in August 2021, when Hank sold 160 acres to a young couple, Rachel and Ben Talley, at $3,200 per acre, while nearby market transactions averaged $5,900. Sale price, $512,000. Market equivalent, $944,000. Immediate embedded equity transferred, $432,000. He required 2 covenants and no bank referral. The land could not be flipped for 10 years, and 5% of annual net farm profit had to flow into their own repair reserve before discretionary spending. Rachel later said that covenant prevented their first major mistake, because in year 2 they wanted a newer sprayer on terms that looked manageable until they modeled fuel, maintenance, and rate reset exposure. They kept their paid-for unit and finished the year solvent. By the spring of 2022, generosity had become a multiplier rather than a one-time gesture. The 12 note recipients, plus the tally operation, and the 4 grant households were directly managing or materially supporting 3,460 acres. At a conservative blended land value of $5,100 per acre, that production footprint represented $17,646,000 in controlled agricultural value, tied in part to Hank's capital discipline. Even discounting that number heavily for leases and shared ownership, the local stabilization effect was substantial. Fewer distressed sales, fewer emergency refinance requests, and fewer operators forced to choose between repairs and planting windows. The deeper examination sat, as always, in line-by-line records. Hank's 2018 through 2025 ledger sequence showed why the generosity was durable rather than performative. 2018, land purchase 480 acres, $1,920,000, closing and corrective work $24,000, machinery buys $118,600, year-end liquid reserves $96,400. 2019, foundation endowment $3 million, farm gross $1,084,300. Total farm costs $792,100, net $292,200. 2020, farm gross $1,102,700, costs $801,600, net $301,100. Treasuries rebuilt to $640,000. 2021, tally land transfer equity concession $432,000, farm net after concession effects $248,900. 2022, gross $1,190,400, costs $858,300, net $332,100. 2023, gross $1,244,600, costs $889,500, net $355,100. 2024, gross $1,208,900, costs $871,400, net $337,500. 2025 projection, finalized after spring contracts. Gross $1,260,000 conservative, costs $902,000, expected net $358,000. The balance sheet that emerged by 2025 carried no mystery once the arithmetic was visible. Owned land, 1,440 acres at a conservative average of $5,800. Total $8,352,000. Grain storage and equipment appraised at $1,140,000, including the rebuilt Big Bud still in seasonal service. Cash and treasuries, $2,060,000 after foundation transfers and concessional land sale. Total net worth, $11,552,000. Long-term debt, $0. Annual fixed personal obligations remained close to the old pattern, modest enough that 1 weak year could not force structural decisions. By the first week of June 2025, Trent had formally ended high-leverage sales promotions at Malloy Ag Systems and shifted the dealership toward inspected used inventory, shorter terms, and clearer downside disclosures. He was not ruined, he was changed. He still sold equipment, but he now asked buyers for sensitivity scenarios before talking paint or horsepower, and he quietly referred 2 younger operators to Hank's foundation when their cash flow models failed conventional underwriting. Hank accepted both applications, approved one, deferred one, and wrote the reasons in the margin like he always had, because vindication for him was never about winning an argument. It was about keeping more families in the field when the cycle turned again. The next Thursday, Hank called the deferred applicant back and closed the loop in the same 2-minute style he used for every hard decision. He approved a smaller note, $18,000 instead of $41,000, required a repair-first plan, and attached quarterly reporting. No one was left waiting on maybe. That administrative discipline mattered as much as any field pass, because the foundation would only last if every exception was still arithmetic. By the end of July 2025, the first full recipient cohort had enough history to evaluate beyond anecdotes. Of the 12 zero-interest equipment notes, averaging $42,000, 8 were current, 3 were on approved extensions, and 1 had been restructured after hail damage reduced expected revenue by $63,400 in a single season. Total principal issued remained $504,000. Total principal repaid had reached $233,600. Outstanding balance was $270,400. Delinquency beyond agreed terms, 0. In any commercial book, that combination would have been unusual, and it was possible only because borrowers were selected for discipline before scale. Nora Jensen became the clearest case of second-generation stabilization. She was 31 by then, managing grain merchandising and hedge policy at the cooperative elevator, while her father, Eli, supervised operations and rail scheduling. Her training grant of $25,000 had paid for certification, software, and 6 months of reduced wages while she apprenticed under a retired merchandiser in Salina. In 2024, she redesigned the cooperative hedge ladder, cutting basis exposure during a volatile quarter and improving average producer settlements by 11 cents per bushel across 1.9 million bushels. That was $209,000 retained locally in one marketing cycle. Eli, who had lost 520 acres to foreclosure in 2011, now drew a steady salary, no personal operating debt, and kept a small paid-for home on the edge of Concordia. He did not return to ownership scale. He returned to stability. Marta Ruiz and her son Luis built a different recovery arc, equally grounded. Marta leased 200 acres on terms she renegotiated with strict downside triggers, and by August 2025, her lease carried no variable rent kicker above a defined yield band. Luis used his grant and retained earnings from custom planning to add a second paid-for planter unit, purchased used for $38,500 with $6,200 in preseason refurbishment. His 2025 spring route covered 3,460 acres across 4 counties, with gross custom revenue of $286,700 and net after labor, fuel, and repairs of $92,400. Marta mentored 3 younger women operators through extension workshops in Reno County and required each one to submit a 1-page cash flow stress test before discussing expansion. Her own auction in 2013 remained painful. It no longer defined her. Cal Bishop never returned to row crop ownership, but he did not need to in order to rebuild a durable life. His repair shop, Bishop Field Service, ran 6 days a week with 2 bays and 1 mobile truck. Beth Bishop's hydraulics unit started with a $25,000 grant plus $14,000 of her own savings, posted $174,300 gross revenue in 2025 through September, netting $61,800 after parts, fuel, and insurance. Cal handled driveline and welding jobs. Beth handled diagnostics and emergency calls. They kept a reserve equal to 5 months of fixed expenses and carried no term debt on equipment. Bankruptcy had ended one chapter. It did not end the family's technical value to the county. Dwayne Holloway's twin sons, Owen and Cole, converted wage work into ownership 1 trailer at a time. Their 5-unit grain trailer fleet, all bought used and rebuilt in Cal's shop, was fully paid. Combined 2024 hauling revenue was $312,000 with net retained earnings of $88,000 after maintenance and labor. Dwayne still drove seasonal harvest crews and winter freight, but now he did it by choice rather than in panic over balloon dates. He rented a modest house near South Hutchinson, kept his expenses lean, and spent Sundays with his grandchildren instead of at lender meetings. Timing had once stripped $195,000 of value from his forced sale. Discipline was now returning value through a different channel. Rachel and Ben Talley, the young couple who bought 160 acres at $3,200 per acre under covenants, reached the point Hank had quietly hoped for: independent judgment. By September 2025, they had reduced principal to $441,000, held a repair reserve of $47,600, and posted 3 consecutive years without revolving operating debt. Their 2024 net was $118,300 after all direct costs and family living expenses. 5% of that, $5,915, went into reserve exactly as required. They sent the proof without prompting. The embedded equity transfer of $432,000 had not become consumption. It became runway. When local extension staff aggregated direct and indirect effects in October 2025, the multiplier was no longer theoretical. Foundation note recipients, grant households, and the tally operation were directly managing or materially supporting 3,980 acres. At a conservative blended value of $5,300 per acre, that represented $21,094,000 in productive agricultural control linked to one man's refusal to borrow for appearances. Even after adjusting for leases, shared ownership, and service-based businesses, county officials credited the network with reducing distressed listings by an estimated 7 to 9 parcels over 3 years. Fewer forced sales meant fewer emergency discounts, and that protected neighbors who never took a dollar from Hank. Trent Malloy's resolution unfolded without drama but with measurable change. By November 2025, Malloy Ag Systems had reduced new high-horsepower inventory by 43% compared with 2018 levels and expanded inspected used units by 61%. Trent rewrote sales compensation so that long-term customer survival counted toward commissions, not just finance volume at signing. He required every finance deal to include a documented downside scenario at lower commodity prices and higher fuel costs. Some salespeople left because the new model paid slower. 2 stayed and adapted. Trent was never publicly shamed, and Hank never pursued that kind of victory. At a winter equipment clinic in mid-December 2025, Trent opened his remarks with a sentence no one expected from the man in the pressed blue shirt. If the payment only works in a good year, it does not work. He then cited county foreclosure data from 2011 through 2014 and described how variable rate resets had hurt families he knew by name. He did not mention Hank directly until the question period, when a young operator asked who had influenced the policy shift. Trent answered plainly, "A farmer I underestimated for 20 years." He left it there. Malloy Ag remained smaller than during the leverage boom, but it was profitable and less exposed. Trent kept his house, kept the business, and changed how he measured success. The irony was sharp and dry. The dealer who once sold urgency now sold margin. He and Hank were not friends in any sentimental sense, yet through that winter they spoke in complete, respectful sentences about parts availability, used hours, and repair intervals. The old tension had resolved into professional clarity. By the final week of December 2025, Cloud County could map every major character to a stable present. Hank Porter was still in the same farmhouse, still driving the 1979 Chevrolet C20. Odometer passed 361,000, rust unpainted, tailgate still secured by baling twine replaced when fibers thinned. The big Bud still ran heavy tillage and winter snow work, now with updated hoses and a rebuilt injector pump, logged at 7,240 service hours since restoration. Hank's annual household budget remained modest by design, under $34,000, and his long-term debt remained zero. Eli Jensen was still at the cooperative elevator, respected for calm during volatile weeks. Nora Jensen was now a partner-level decision-maker in merchandising policy and teaching younger staff how to model, carry, and basis risk before making commitments. Marta Ruiz was still leasing 200 acres profitably and mentoring women operators through structured workshops. Luis Ruiz was still expanding custom planning only when cash flow justified another unit. Cal Bishop was still in the repair bay by sunrise. Beth Bishop was still running mobile hydraulics across 3 counties. Dwayne Holloway was still driving seasonal crews, but now with savings targets he hit each quarter. Owen and Cole Holloway were still hauling grain with paid-for trailers and no balloon structures. Rachel and Ben Talley were still on their 160 acres, still honoring the anti-flip covenant, still sending reserve statements. Howard Blakely, the neighbor whose 1985 auction had marked Hank at 19, had passed away in 2009 after years of hourly work and a small garden plot he cared for meticulously. His widow, June Blakely, lived with her daughter in Salina and received a quiet annual gift through the Foundation Hardship Line, $6,000 each December for medical travel and utilities, no publicity attached. Glenn Porter had been gone since 1996, but his warning remained on that old handwritten tag, laminated now, hanging in Hank's shed above the maintenance board, where dates and part numbers were still entered by hand. The system endured because it was specific. Price downside first. Keep fixed obligations survivable. Buy utility, not status. Store grain when basis pays. Hold reserves for timing. Help people with terms that demand discipline, not dependence. Hank never framed it as doctrine. He just kept doing it. That evening, after the clinic talk had already become coffee shop gossip, Hank sat at the kitchen table and entered 2 lines in the paper ledger from the biscuit tin. 1 foundation payment received, 1 parts order due before spring teardown. He closed the book, capped the pen, and set the tin back on the shelf without ceremony. At dusk that same day, Hank parked the Chevrolet beside the shed, checked the twine knot on the tailgate, and shut the door with the same firm push he had used for 30 years. Wind moved across last year's stubble. The big Bud sat inside under warm shop light, paint uneven, engine quiet, ready for morning. On the wall above it hung Glenn's sentence in black block letters, no longer a warning alone, now a record proven in acres, ledgers and families still farming. At first light, Hank stepped back into the shed, clicked on the bench lamp, and pulled the biscuit tin down from the shelf. The metal lid still stuck on damp mornings, so he tapped it once with the handle of a screwdriver, opened it, and set 3 stacks on the table: foundation notes, land files, and machine records. The worn brown folder from the 2018 estate auction went into a new deed binder, with the cashier check stubs clipped behind the closing statement and tile invoices. The old sale bill for lot 117. The field cultivator Trent once said cash buyers did not touch, slid into the equipment file with a penciled update. Still in service, sweep set replaced. Total lifetime repairs, $2,140. Nothing sat loose anymore. Every paper had a place, and every place had a reason. A truck pulled into the yard just as he finished labeling the binder spine. Rachel and Ben Talley climbed out carrying a box of donuts and a manila envelope. Ben set the envelope on the table and said, Quarterly reserve statement, 49,300 now. We rounded up. Rachel added a cashier receipt for an extra principal payment of $12,000, then pointed at the anti-flip covenant page she had copied and highlighted. Still 10 years. We are not selling. Hank read each page, nodded once, and wrote 2 lines on their ledger card. Principal outstanding, $429,000. Reserve compliance, verified. He handed the card back. Keep your sprayer. Fix what you own. Rachel smiled. We did. Pump rebuild was $3,800. New one would have been $71,000 plus interest. Hank put the card away and cut the donut box open with his pocket knife. The exchange took 6 minutes. The runway got longer. By the 3rd week of January 2026, the extension classroom in Concordia was full for the Foundation's annual Compliance Day. 12 equipment note operators sat at folding tables with binders open, each one reporting acreage, fixed costs, and debt exposure. The mood was not ceremonial. It was practical. Nora Jensen ran the screen at the front and projected a 1-page summary. Original note pool, $504,000. Principal repaid $251,900. Outstanding $252,100. Defaulted loans, $0. Average days late beyond approved terms, $0. She clicked to the next slide where fuel, parts, and insurance costs were stress tested at plus 20%. 8 operations still passed with positive cash flow. 4 required contingency cuts, already documented. Eli stood in the back by the coffee urn and watched Nora teach younger operators how to model basis risk with the same patience he once used to adjust planter depth. Marta sat beside Luis, marking up a worksheet from a 24-year-old tenant who wanted to double acres with borrowed machinery. Marta circled the payment line and told him quietly, "If one bad year ends your choices, it is too tight." Luis followed with numbers from his custom route. Gross, $301,400 for the spring season booked. Fuel locked for 40% of expected use. No term debt. Reserve target 6 months fixed overhead. Beth Bishop walked in late from a roadside hydraulic call, grease on one sleeve, and dropped a payment receipt on the desk. Her mobile units had crossed $200,000 gross the prior year, with net margin just above 34%, because she refused to finance a second truck before the first earned it. After lunch, Owen and Cole Holloway rolled in from a grain run with salt on their boots and handed over their trailer fleet ledger. 5 units. Purchase and rebuild basis $186,700 total. Current appraised value, $241,000. Cash reserve, $63,200. They had started setting aside money for a 6th trailer, but scratched the plan when insurance quotes rose. Dwayne, leaning against the wall in a clean but faded jacket, listened to his sons explain why they waited. "You taught us what balloon dates feel like," Owen said. Dwayne answered with a half nod. "I taught you once. The bank taught me first." The multiplier now had names attached to every acre. Foundation recipients, grant households, and the Tally Farm were directly managing or materially supporting 4,210 acres by documented books, at a conservative blended value of $5,450 per acre. That was $22,944,500 in productive control, tied to one capital system built on zero-interest discipline and strict reporting. The county extension agent, reading from the compiled sheet, noted 9 distressed listings prevented or delayed through reserve interventions and equipment note restructures. No applause followed. People wrote down the numbers and kept talking about repairs, rent terms, and rainfall probabilities. In early February 2026, Trent Malloy held a customer meeting in the service bay at Malloy Ag Systems, not the showroom. The chairs were mismatched. The coffee was plain. He stood beside a whiteboard listing 3 columns in black marker. Purchase price, payment at 7%, payment at 9%. Then he added a 4th column in red, bad year revenue case. The salesman who had once asked Hank if he was there to load equipment sat in the 2nd row, now promoted to used equipment manager, taking notes instead of smirking. Trent spoke without hurry. If the red column fails, we do not write the deal. He walked through a proposed tractor package and showed total paid under 2 rate paths. At 7% over 7 years, $198,000 became $298,200 with fees and insurance riders. At 9%, it crossed $331,000. He erased it and replaced it with a used unit plus refurbishment. $84,500 cash equivalent, or $103,900 with short financing. I earn less commission on this, he said. You keep your farm longer. After the meeting, he found Hank near the parts counter checking injector lines for the Big Bud. Trent held out a folder. Inside was a dealership policy update requiring downside modeling on every financed quote and a section on repair first alternatives. You were right about volatility, Trent said. Hank looked at the page, then at him. Numbers were right. Trent gave a short laugh. Fair. He added almost to himself, I spent 20 years selling speed. I should have sold survivability sooner. By the first week of April 2026, the roll call could be done in one room with no missing names. Hank still farmed out of the same yard in Cloud County, still debt-free, still logging maintenance by hand on the board under Glenn's laminated warning. The Big Bud still ran heavy ground and winter pushes, now at 7,410 service hours since rebuild, with the C's turbo chapter long closed and every replacement part documented by date and cost. The 1979 Chevrolet still hauled filters and fence posts, odometer past 366,000, tailgate twine replaced twice that winter and noted on a sticky tab in the vehicle folder, because small neglect always became large expense if ignored. Eli still ran operations at the cooperative elevator and slept through the night. Nora now chaired the cooperative risk committee. Marta still leased 200 acres and mentored women operators with written stress tests. Louise still expanded custom acres only after reserve targets were met. Cal still opened Bishop Field service before sunrise. Beth still ran emergency hydraulics across 3 counties with no lender on her title. Dwayne still drove seasonal crews, now with quarterly savings goals he hit. Owen and Cole still hauled grain with paid-for trailers and no balloons. Rachel and Ben still worked their 160 acres, still honored the covenant, still sent reserve statements on time. June Blakely still received the December hardship gift, and this year she mailed a handwritten note back. Utility paid, medical travel covered, thank you for remembering Howard by action. If you want more stories where a plain ledger outlasts polished sales talk, subscribe and stay close to this channel. If the story pressed on a real decision in your own life, comment with the exact trade-off you are facing right now, payment versus patience, and include your numbers. Share this with one farmer, one small business owner, or one young couple who looks broke from the road but is trying to build quietly the right way. At sunset that evening, Hank closed the shed doors and stood for a moment in the aisle between the Big Bud and the tool bench. The laminated tag above the maintenance board caught the last light from the west window. Debt will farm you before you farm land. The sentence had started as a warning from a father who had seen too many auctions. It ended as a working system proven in acres held, notes repaid, families stabilized, and choices preserved. The poorest-looking truck in the county rolled out of the yard toward another morning, and the richest thing in it was still discipline.